bright spotlight on the stage, thunderous applause from the audience as gymnasts perform in an international competition. The flips, perfect spins, and flawless jumps create a dazzling and beautiful image of American gymnastics. But behind these glorious moments lies a painful and dark story that none of us could have imagined. It is the story of U.S. gymnasts who suffered horrific trauma for years from those they trusted the most. American gymnastics is a proud sport, one that has brought the country numerous Olympic gold medals, shining a light on U.S. athletics. On the world stage, these dazzling moments have been etched in the minds of fans, but few know the terrifying truth behind the glory. A large-scale sexual abuse scandal that spanned decades. In 2020, Netflix released the documentary Athlete A, exposing the USA Gymnastics sexual abuse scandal. This film not only shocked the world of sports, but also shook American society when it exposed a truth that had previously been whispered about in hushed tones. However, it wasn't until 2016 that this scandal officially came to light, causing the world to reassess one of the most powerful sports organizations in the world. USA Gymnastics USAG is the national governing body for gymnastics in the United States, responsible for training and developing athletes from youth levels to the national teams. This organization has helped produce famous athletes such as Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, Gabby Douglas, and many others who have brought glory to U.S. sports. They are not just Olympic gold medalists, but also idealized models of dedication, discipline, and tireless perseverance. However, behind this glittering success, another story was unfolding. It is the story of Larry Nassar, the former USA Gymnastics team doctor, who exploited the trust of hundreds of young athletes to carry out horrific acts of sexual abuse that no one suspected. Nassar was beloved, trusted, and considered a friend to the athletes. He was the doctor who treated them for their injuries, and the person they looked to for guidance. But hidden behind this persona was a criminal who exploited his position for years to abuse his power. Larry Nassar, the monster behind the mask. Larry Nassar was not a stranger to the gymnastic world. He was a famous sports doctor known not only for his expertise, but also for the trust athletes placed in him. Nassar had been involved with the national team, treating thousands of gymnasts, including some of the biggest names like Simone Biles and Ailey Raisman. These athletes, who had conquered the highest stages of international competition, placed their complete trust in him. Little did they know, the man they trusted was actually the person abusing them. Over many years, Nassar's tactics were very subtle. He exploited his role as a doctor to carry out sexual abuse under the guise of medical treatment. This abuse went on for a long time, affecting gymnasts as young as 13 years old and continuing with those who had already won Olympic medals. In the documentary Athlete A, the victims share their painful stories of how Nassar took advantage of them. They had to endure this abuse in silence, fearing that speaking out would destroy their careers, cost them their chances of competing, and even lead to ostracization. But when a few courageous athletes came forward, the truth was finally revealed. And this didn't just shock the public. It sparked a movement calling for justice for the many victims who had suffered in silence. The silence and the system that protected Nassar for years. This scandal was covered up by the U.S. gymnastics system. Coaches, supervisors, and sports administrators did nothing to stop Nassar's actions. They ignored warning signs and protected the image of the sport, forcing the victims to suffer in silence. Why didn't they speak out? Is a question many people ask when learning about this scandal. The truth is, young athletes were threatened and pressured to remain silent. If they spoke out, they risked losing their chances of competing, or worse, their entire gymnastics career. The system didn't protect them. It created an environment where abuse could go unnoticed for decades. Expected progression of the video's next part will analyze the verdicts and outcomes of the lawsuits, the efforts of the athletes to seek justice, and justice for the victims. The final segment will provide an overview of the legacy of this scandal, including policy changes to protect athletes, Nassar's conviction, and the long-lasting effects on U.S. sports. Part 1. The Glory and the Silence. U.S. Gymnastics in the spotlight. Shocking world of USA Gymnastics. USA Gymnastics is a name that represents the epitome of excellence in the world of gymnastics. The organization has long been the leading force behind the United States' dominance in international gymnastics. For decades, it has been home to some of the most accomplished athletes in the sport. From Mary Lou Retton, the first American female gymnast to win an Olympic gold medal in 1984, to the modern legends like Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, and Gabby Douglas, these athletes didn't just bring home medals, they brought hope, pride, and inspiration to millions across the United States. The U.S. gymnastics team became a shining symbol of perseverance, strength, and skill. Athletes like Biles, Raisman, and Douglas were revered not only for their athletic abilities, but also for their exemplary character. As young girls, they dreamed of representing their country on the Olympic stage, of achieving greatness and of making history. However, what the public never knew was that behind the scenes, there was a dark undercurrent of exploitation, secrecy, and unimaginable abuse that would go on to shock the world. The role of Larry Nassar, a trusted physician turned predator for years. Larry Nassar was seen as a trusted doctor within the gymnastics world. As the team physician for USA Gymnastics, Nassar treated some of the most elite athletes in the sport, using his medical expertise to help them recover from injuries and perform at their best. He had a reputation for being knowledgeable, caring, and compassionate. However, this reputation was built on lies, a carefully crafted image that masked the horrifying truth. Nassar's abuse began as a secret. He began as a doctor performing legitimate treatments, but soon crossed the line. What started as routine physical therapy for injuries, particularly related to gymnasts' delicate joints and muscles, gradually became something far more sinister. He used his position of power and trust to manipulate and sexually abuse the athletes who came to him for help. His victims were often young girls, some of whom were just children. Nassar's method was subtle at first. Under the guise of medical treatment, he would abuse the young athletes while they were vulnerable, trusting him to provide the care they needed to continue their training and pursue their dreams. It was not just one or two victims. Nassar's abuse spanned decades and affected hundreds of young women, but for years, no one suspected anything. The silence surrounding the abuse was maintained by Nassar's power, the trust of the athletes, and the systemic failures of those who should have been watching for signs of such misconduct. The unspoken culture of silence. Why did no one speak up? The culture within USA Gymnastics and the broader sports industry often made it difficult for victims to speak out. There was a pervasive silence surrounding sexual abuse, especially within sports where the stakes were so high. Athletes, particularly those with big dreams of making it to the Olympics, feared the consequences of speaking out. They worried that if they reported abuse, they would be ostracized, blacklisted from competition, or their careers would be ruined. The pressure to stay silent was immense. Gymnasts were taught to push through pain and suffering for the sake of their sport. No pain, no gain was the mantra. When it came to the emotional and physical trauma caused by Nassar, many believed they had no right to complain. They were conditioned to see themselves as lucky to be part of a sport that required such extraordinary levels of sacrifice and dedication. Coaches and officials also contributed to the silence. Instead of offering support, many of them either turned a blind eye or, worse, protected Nassar for the sake of the sport's reputation. The focus was always on the success of the athlete, on winning medals, and on maintaining the Olympic legacy. The system placed so much importance on performance that it often overlooked the well-being of the individual. In the pursuit of success, the voices of the victims were drowned out by the cries of triumph from the gymnasts on the podiums. A systemic failure. The protectors who became enablers. What made Nassar's abuse possible was not just his actions alone, but the larger system that failed to hold him accountable. USA Gymnastics and others in positions of power were complicit in allowing him to continue his abuse. Coaches, administrators, and officials within the organization failed to act despite numerous red flags. They didn't investigate claims or warnings from concerned parents or colleagues. Instead, they protected Nassar, fearing the damage his removal would do to the sport. Reports from victims of abuse were ignored. Nassar's manipulation was so effective that even when athletes confided in their coaches or spoke up about inappropriate behavior, they were often told to be quiet, that it was just part of the treatment process, or that they were exaggerating. In many instances, Nassar was able to continue his abuse unchecked because he had the support of those at the top, people who were more concerned with winning than with protecting young athletes. The whistleblowers. How the truth came to light. It wasn't until 2016 that the truth began to surface. A small group of brave survivors, led by Rachel Denhollander, who would become the first to publicly accuse Nassar, came forward. Denhollander, a former gymnast herself, was determined to expose the truth. At the time, many still believed that Nassar was an upstanding professional, and his abuse was just an isolated incident. But Denhollander's persistence in reporting him, alongside the courageous actions of other survivors, was instrumental in unraveling the facade. In 2016, investigative journalists from the Indianapolis Star, led by Marissa Kwiatkowski, began digging into Nassar's history. What they found was staggering. Dozens of women came forward to share their experiences. Journalists uncovered a pattern of abuse that spanned decades, with Nassar abusing athletes in multiple locations, including at the Karolyi Ranch, a national training facility for U.S. gymnasts, and even in his private practice. The investigation revealed the extent of Nassar's crimes, and the public outrage grew. The story quickly became a media sensation, and the victims began to find their voices. It was no longer just a few brave individuals speaking up. It became a massive movement of women united to demand justice. The fight for justice, courtrooms, and sentencing in 2018. After years of silence, Larry Nassar was finally held accountable for his actions. The trial was a public spectacle, with 156 victims making statements in court, describing their experiences in excruciating detail. Nassar's defense was feeble, and he ultimately admitted to sexually abusing hundreds of young athletes. On January 24, 2018, Nassar was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison for his crimes. The sentencing was a major victory for the survivors, but for many, it was just one piece of the healing process. The damage Nassar had caused could never truly be undone, but his conviction marked the beginning of justice for the victims and the dismantling of the system that allowed his actions to go unnoticed for so long. The lasting legacy, rebuilding. The trust in USA Gymnastics' the aftermath of the scandal left a deep scar on the gymnastics community. In the years since Nassar's conviction, USA Gymnastics has been forced to confront its past, reevaluating its practices and policies. The organization has undergone a major overhaul in terms of leadership and has taken steps to implement better protections for athletes. They introduced stricter protocols for handling abuse claims and have sought to create a safer environment for young athletes. However, the road to rebuilding trust will be long. Many former gymnasts have called for more accountability from those who failed to act sooner. The scandal exposed not just the crimes of one man, but the systemic failures that allowed it to continue for so long. The survivors of Larry Nassar's abuse will continue to fight for change, using their voices to ensure that the next generation of athletes is protected. Conclusion: the story of Larry Nassar and the survivors of his abuse is one of pain, betrayal, and resilience. It is a reminder that power, trust, and reputation can often be used to manipulate and silence those who are most vulnerable. But it is also a story of strength, the strength of the women who refuse to stay silent, and the strength of the survivors who continue to stand together, demanding justice and protection for future generations. Their courage has sparked significant changes in the sports world, but the fight for justice and reform is ongoing. Room 57 will continue to follow this story as it unfolds, and we invite you to join us on this journey. Part 2, The Silence Breaks. How the scandal was uncovered at the first whispers of abuse. Rachel Denhollander and the power of one voice. While Larry Nassar's reign of abuse seemed to go unnoticed for years, in the background, there were individuals who suspected something was wrong and began raising their voices. However, those initial cries were ignored or silenced by the very systems that should have protected them. In 2016, the first real push against Nassar came from a brave woman named Rachel Denhollander, a former gymnast who had trained under the USA Gymnastics system. Rachel was the first athlete to publicly accuse Nassar of sexual abuse. Her courage to come forward came at a high price, as it meant challenging the institution she had once trusted. Rachel's story is a testament to the power of a single voice. She had been sexually abused by Nassar when she was just a young gymnast, and like many others, she had buried the pain for years. After reading about Nassar's continued work with other athletes, Rachel decided she could not remain silent any longer. She sought legal counsel and eventually reported Nassar's actions to the authorities, detailing how he had manipulated her under the guise of medical treatment. At first, her story was dismissed, but Rachel's determination never wavered. With the help of a lawyer, she filed a civil lawsuit against Nassar and USA Gymnastics, demanding that the abuse be taken seriously and that justice be served. Her courage in filing the lawsuit eventually opened the floodgates. Other survivors began to come forward, sharing their own harrowing accounts of abuse at the hands of Nassar. Rachel Denhollander's decision to speak out paved the way for others. As the first woman to publicly accuse Nassar, she took the brunt of public scrutiny and had to battle her own demons, while also fighting for the rights of countless others who had been silenced for years. Her willingness to be the first to speak up showed other survivors that it was not only okay to come forward, but necessary. The investigation, journalists stepped in as the survivors began to share their stories. The media started to take notice. The first breakthrough came when investigative journalists from the Indianapolis Star, led by reporter Marissa Kwiatkowski, began probing into the allegations. Marissa had covered sexual abuse cases before, but this one was different. The sheer scale of the abuse and the fact that it had been going on for so many years raised alarm bells. Kwiatkowski, along with fellow reporter Tim Evans, began investigating Nassar's long history with USA Gymnastics. The reporters faced many challenges in their investigation, including initial resistance from the organization and attempts to silence the victims. However, they were undeterred. They combed through records, interviewed victims, and dug into the timeline of Nassar's work with USA Gymnastics, slowly piecing together a picture that was far darker than anyone could have imagined. One of the major turning points in their investigation was when they found documents That indicated USA Gymnastics had known about Nassar's abuse, but had done little to stop him. In fact, the organization had dismissed complaints and allowed Nassar to continue treating athletes under the false pretense of medical necessity. This discovery was a game changer, as it revealed that the issue wasn't just about one man's criminal acts. It was about a larger systemic failure that allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. As the investigation progressed, more athletes came forward to speak about their experiences, and Marissa Kwiatkowski and Tim Evans continued to push forward, knowing the weight of their findings would soon ignite a public outcry. The media firestorm, exposing the truth by the time the Indianapolis Star published their investigative piece in 2016. The scale of the abuse was fully exposed to the public. The article provided a detailed account of how Nassar had been allowed to continue his abuse for decades, despite multiple reports and complaints from athletes, their families, and even medical professionals who had been suspicious of his behavior. It also highlighted the failure of USA Gymnastics to protect its athletes, and its willingness to turn a blind eye to the abuse in favor of maintaining the sport's image. The Indianapolis Star report was a pivotal moment in the scandal. It wasn't just an expose of Nassar's crimes, it was a look at how an entire system, built on trust and the safety of young athletes, had failed to protect them. The story quickly spread across the nation and worldwide, sparking outrage and calls for justice. In the wake of the article, survivors who had remained silent for years began to speak out in unprecedented numbers. Social media and various news outlets allowed their voices to be amplified, and soon, their stories were everywhere. The public, the gymnastics world, and the broader sports community were in shock. How had this abuse been allowed to continue for so long? The legal battle, holding the system accountable for the media coverage. Survivors of Nassar's abuse began to file lawsuits, not just against Nassar, but also against USA Gymnastics and Michigan State University, where Nassar had worked for decades. These lawsuits sought justice for the survivors and held the institutions accountable for their failure to protect young athletes from abuse. The lawsuits also began to reveal how Nassar's actions were not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger pattern of abuse. His victims weren't just a handful of gymnasts, they were hundreds. The survivors came from different backgrounds, ages, and nationalities, but they all shared one painful experience. They were betrayed by the very people and institutions they trusted. As the legal battle unfolded, it became clear that the case was not just about seeking compensation for the victims, but also about forcing cultural change in the world of sports. The lawsuits aimed to expose the truth and ensure that future athletes would not face the same fate. They sought to challenge the toxic culture within USA Gymnastics and other organizations that place deep performance and medals above the safety and well-being of athletes. The trial. Nassar faces justice in 2018. Larry Nassar was finally brought to trial, where he faced the charges of sexual abuse brought against him by over 150 women and girls. His trial became a landmark event, as survivors were given the opportunity to share their stories in court, detailing the abuse they suffered at his hands. The trial was an emotional and harrowing experience for both the survivors and the public. It was a chance for Nassar's victims to be heard and to confront the man who had caused them so much pain. In January 2018, Nassar was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison for his crimes. His sentencing was a long-awaited moment of justice for the survivors, who had spent years fighting for recognition and accountability. The survivors' statements during the trial were a powerful testament to their strength and resilience. In many cases, they spoke out not just for themselves, but for the other victims who couldn't or hadn't yet come forward. The trial was a moment of reckoning for USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and the entire world of sports. It was clear that these institutions had failed in their duty to protect young athletes, and they would be forced to face the consequences of their negligence. The aftermath, a changed system following Nassar's conviction. Many survivors turned their attention to changing the culture and policies that allowed such abuse to take place. They demanded reforms within USA Gymnastics, including the establishment of stronger protections for athletes, more accountability, and transparency in the handling of abuse complaints. Several survivors also became advocates for legislative changes, working to pass laws that would make it easier for victims of abuse to come forward and hold institutions accountable. In the wake of the scandal, USA Gymnastics faced widespread condemnation, and many of its leaders resigned or were removed from their positions. The organization began to implement reforms in response to the demands of the survivors, but the road to recovery would be long and fraught with challenges. The scandal also brought attention to the broader issue of sexual abuse in sports. It prompted many other sports organizations, from gymnastics to other Olympic sports, to reevaluate their policies and practices. The Nassar case highlighted the need for systemic change to ensure that athletes' safety is prioritized over the pursuit of medals and national prestige. Conclusion: the sexual abuse scandal involving Larry Nassar is one of the most devastating and far-reaching incidents in the history of U.S. sports. It exposed the dark side of gymnastics, a sport that has long been celebrated for its grace and discipline. But out of the darkness came a powerful movement of survivors who stood up for justice, broke their silence, and demanded change. Thanks to their courage, a system that had long protected predators was forced to confront its failures. The legal, social, and cultural implications of the Nassar scandal continue to reverberate throughout the world of sports, and the survivors' fight for justice and reform is far from over. Part 3. Justice and Accountability, a New Era for Athlete Protection Reckoning, Nassar's Trial and the Power of Survivor Voices. The trial of Larry Nassar in 2018 was not just another legal proceeding. It was a moment of reckoning for the entire world of sports, especially USA Gymnastics. After years of silence, hundreds of survivors were finally able to confront the man who had stolen their trust, their dignity, and their futures. This was the moment when the world saw the full scale of the abuse that had occurred and heard, for the first time, the voices of the women who had suffered in silence for so long. Over the course of Nassar's trial, more than 156 survivors gave victim impact statements in court. These women, athletes, mothers, daughters, and sisters, came forward with incredible courage to tell their stories. They described the abuse they had endured as children and young adults, the manipulation and the exploitation they suffered in the name of medical treatment. The public was left stunned by the courage of these women and the depth of Nassar's betrayal. Each of these statements was a powerful, emotional declaration of survival for many survivors. This was not just about seeking justice for themselves, but for the generations of young athletes who had been victims before them and would likely face similar dangers if the system did not change. These statements, often filled with raw emotion, made it clear that Nassar's actions were not an isolated occurrence, but part of a deeply ingrained system of neglect within USA Gymnastics. The impact statements were broadcast across the world, and millions watched as women shared the unspeakable pain they had suffered. Simone Biles, the most decorated gymnast of all time, also took the stand, her voice breaking as she described how she had been preyed upon by Nassar. For her, the trial was a turning point. It was no longer just about gymnastics. It was about taking back control, reclaiming her voice, and standing in solidarity with the other survivors who had been denied justice for so long. Rachel Denhollander, the first woman to publicly accuse Nassar, was one of the survivors who delivered a profound impact statement. She spoke not only for herself, but for the other survivors who could not be there. Her words became a rallying cry for all survivors of sexual abuse in sports. Her voice, initially silenced by shame and fear, now echoed in courtrooms and living rooms around the world, pushing for systemic changes that would protect athletes in the future. The long road to conviction, the importance of accountability. Nassar's trial was a significant moment in the journey for justice, but it was far from the end. Nassar's crimes were egregious, and his sentencing was a long-awaited moment of justice for the victims. On January 24, 2018, Nassar was sentenced to 40 to 175 years in prison for sexually abusing young gymnasts. This sentence was the culmination of years of legal work, advocacy, and personal sacrifices by the survivors and their supporters. However, the sentencing wasn't just about one man being held accountable. It was about the broader system that allowed his actions to continue for decades. The survivors and their advocates were determined not only to see Nassar imprisoned, but also to ensure that the institutions that failed to protect them were held responsible. USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University, and other organizations involved in the scandal would have to face the consequences of their inaction. The sentencing was a bittersweet victory for many survivors, knowing that Nassar would spend the rest of his life in prison provided some measure of justice, but the damage was irreversible. The trauma endured by these athletes could never be undone. The trial may have brought Nassar to justice, but the larger fight for institutional accountability had just begun. The fallout. USA Gymnastics faces public scrutiny. The spotlight soon turned to USA Gymnastics, the organization that had long protected Nassar and allowed his abuse to continue. As the scale of the scandal grew, the public demanded answers. How could USA Gymnastics, the very organization that was supposed to protect athletes, allow such horrific abuse to happen under its watch? How did the leadership fail to recognize the signs of misconduct? And why was Nassar allowed to continue working with young athletes for so long? In the wake of Nassar's sentencing, USA Gymnastics was left grappling with its role in perpetuating the abuse. Many of the organization's top leaders, including Steve Penny, the president of USA Gymnastics, resigned in the wake of the scandal. Penny had been in charge during much of the time that Nassar's abuse took place, and his failure to act when warnings were raised about Nassar's behavior was widely criticized. USA Gymnastics faced severe public backlash, with many calling for a complete overhaul of the organization. Survivors and their advocates demanded that the system be restructured to ensure that young athletes would never again be exposed to such a system of secrecy, manipulation, and abuse. The survivors were not content with simply seeing Nassar convicted. They wanted a broader cultural shift in the world of sports, particularly in gymnastics. The investigation also revealed that Michigan State University MSU, where Nassar had worked as a physician, had failed to investigate complaints about his behavior or remove him from his position. MSU also faced public scrutiny, and many questioned why the university had ignored numerous reports of Nassar's inappropriate behavior over the years. MSU was eventually forced to pay out millions of dollars in settlements to Nassar's victims. Legislative changes. A new era for athlete protection. Sexual abuse scandal prompted significant changes, not only within the sports organizations, but also at the national legislative level. In response to the overwhelming outcry over the failure to protect athletes, several states and the federal government began taking steps to implement new laws designed to protect athletes from sexual abuse. In 2018, the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act was signed into law, which required all national governing bodies of sports to report any allegations of sexual abuse to law enforcement within 24 hours. The law also mandates that these organizations take immediate action to remove any coaches or officials accused of sexual misconduct. The law was a direct response to the failings exposed by the Nassar case and was aimed at ensuring that future generations of athletes would be better protected. Additionally, the USA Gymnastics Safe Sport program was established to provide a more robust system for reporting and addressing allegations of sexual abuse in gymnastics. Safe Sport is designed to give athletes a confidential and secure way to report abuse without fear of retaliation. It also seeks to educate athletes, coaches, and officials about how to recognize the signs of abuse and take action to prevent it. Though these legislative changes were seen as an important first step, many survivors and advocates argue that much more needs to be done to change the culture of sports. The focus must be on athlete welfare, with a commitment to transparency, accountability, and a zero-tolerance policy for sexual abuse. The survivors movement, from victims to advocates for many of the women who survived Larry Nassar's abuse. The trial and Nassar's conviction marked the beginning of their own journey toward healing. But for many of them, their fight didn't end with Nassar's imprisonment. Survivors of sexual abuse often find healing through advocacy and giving a voice to others who are suffering in silence. Several of Nassar's victims, including Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, and Michaela Maroney, became outspoken advocates for change within the gymnastics community and beyond. They used their platform to speak out against sexual abuse in sports and to demand accountability from organizations that had failed to protect them. Their courage has inspired a new generation of athletes to stand up for themselves and each other, knowing that they have the power to change the system. In addition to their advocacy work, many survivors have also become involved in legislation aimed at protecting athletes from abuse. They have lobbied for stronger laws and have worked with lawmakers to ensure that the systems put in place to protect athletes are enforced. These survivors are determined to make sure that no other young athlete has to endure what they went through. Their stories have resonated far beyond the gymnastics world. The Nassar scandal sparked conversations about the culture of abuse in sports, and survivors have become part of a broader movement to end sexual abuse in all areas of society. Their voices have been instrumental in bringing about lasting change, and their resilience continues to inspire those who are fighting for justice and protection from abuse. Conclusion: a changed landscape for U.S. sports. Nassar scandal changed the landscape of American sports forever. It exposed deep flaws within the systems that were supposed to protect athletes and led to sweeping reforms across the sports world. But while Nassar's conviction was a necessary step toward justice, the work of the survivors is far from over. The battle for systemic change continues, and their voices will remain central to that fight. In the wake of this scandal, the conversation about sexual abuse in sports has gained momentum, leading to stronger protections for athletes and more accountability for the organizations that govern them. The survivors of Larry Nassar's abuse have become trailblazers for a new era in sports, one where the safety and well-being of athletes come first. The road ahead is long, but thanks to their bravery, a safer future is within reach for athletes everywhere. Part 4. The Aftermath, a new era of accountability and healing. Rebuilding trust. The struggle for reform in USA Gymnastics. The fallout from the Larry Nassar scandal was far-reaching, extending beyond the immediate pain of the survivors and into the heart of U.S. gymnastics itself. The organization, once a symbol of American athletic excellence, now faced the daunting task of rebuilding its reputation and restoring the public's trust. But in the wake of Nassar's crimes, the process of reform and healing would prove to be a difficult and lengthy one. In the months A years following Nassar's conviction, USA Gymnastics found itself under intense scrutiny. The organization was under fire not just for Nassar's actions, but for its institutional failures to prevent the abuse. The public's outrage grew as it became clear that USA Gymnastics had failed to protect its athletes. Despite numerous reports of Nassar's inappropriate behavior that spanned over 2 decades, many individuals in leadership positions at USA Gymnastics resigned or were removed from their posts, and the organization was forced to re-examine its structure and policies. Steve Penny, the former president of USA Gymnastics, was one of the first to step down, following public outcry over his role in enabling the abuse. Penny had been in charge during the period when many of the abuse allegations were raised, and under his leadership, the organization failed to adequately address the concerns raised by the victims. Penny's departure was just the first step toward the broader changes that needed to occur. As part of its efforts to address the scandal, USA Gymnastics initiated reforms aimed at increasing athlete protection and improving its internal processes. These changes included the implementation of stricter background checks for coaches and staff, new protocols for handling abuse allegations, and the creation of a more robust safe sport program. However, the real test for USA Gymnastics was not in the reforms themselves, but in their implementation and enforcement. For many survivors, the changes within USA Gymnastics were not enough. They demanded more than just surface-level changes. They wanted a cultural shift within the organization, one that prioritized the safety and well-being of athletes over the pursuit of success at any cost. This was a central issue, as the culture of silence and abuse had been so deeply entrenched within the system. Survivors and their advocates were determined that the organization would never again place medals and Olympic glory above the protection of its athletes. The role of Congress and the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act Nassar case not only led to significant changes within USA Gymnastics, but also spurred nationwide legal reforms in response to the public outcry and the overwhelming evidence that sexual abuse in sports had been ignored for far too long. Congress passed the Protecting Young Victims from Sexual Abuse Act of 2018. This landmark legislation was designed to prevent future abuse and ensure that sports organizations take swift action when allegations of sexual abuse arise. The law mandates that all national governing bodies of sports must report any allegations of sexual abuse to law enforcement within 24 hours. It also requires these organizations to implement safeguarding measures for athletes and to take immediate action when abuse allegations are made. The law further requires that anyone convicted of sexually abusing a minor in a sports setting be banned for life from participating in sports activities. This legislation marked a turning point in the way that sexual abuse is addressed within sports organizations. It sent a clear message that the safety of athletes must be prioritized, and that failure to act on abuse allegations would no longer be tolerated. The passing of this law was seen as a victory by the survivors, many of whom have fought for years to bring about change in the system. But even as the law was enacted, advocates for athlete protection knew that there was still much work to be done. The law was just one step in the long road to reform, a shift in the culture of sport. The power of survivor advocacy, perhaps the most significant change following the Nassar scandal, has been the rise of survivor advocacy. The women who came forward to expose Nassar's abuse have not only fought for justice for themselves, but have become vocal advocates for athletes' rights and protections. Their courage in speaking out and holding powerful institutions accountable has created a ripple effect that is changing the landscape of sport. Athletes like Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, and Michaela Maroney have used their platforms to advocate for systemic change within the world of gymnastics and beyond. They have worked tirelessly to ensure that no other young athlete has to go through the same trauma they endured. They have lobbied for stronger protections, better resources for athletes, and a cultural shift that places the safety of athletes above the pursuit of medals and sponsorship deals. In addition to their work within gymnastics, these survivors have become outspoken advocates for the protection of all athletes. They have spoken at congressional hearings, participated in public forums, and worked with organizations that provide support for survivors of sexual abuse. Their advocacy has led to increased awareness about the prevalence of sexual abuse in sports and has inspired other athletes to speak out about their own experiences. Simone Biles, in particular, has become a powerful voice for change. As one of the most decorated gymnasts in history, she has used her fame to amplify the voices of the survivors who are still fighting for justice. Biles has been vocal about her own abuse by Nassar, and her decision to come forward was a pivotal moment in the fight for accountability. "I was so young, I didn't realize what had happened to me until later in life," Biles said in an interview. "It was a shame that I had to go through that, but I'm proud that I am able to stand here today and speak up about it." Her decision to speak out has had a profound impact on the world of gymnastics. and her courage continues to inspire others to follow her lead. The legacy of the Nassar scandal. Transforming sports culture. The legacy of the Nassar scandal is far-reaching. It has forever changed the way sexual abuse is viewed and addressed within the world of sports. Prior to the scandal, sexual abuse in sports was often seen as an unfortunate but isolated occurrence. Athletes were conditioned to stay silent, and sports organizations often prioritized winning over protecting their athletes. Today, the conversation has shifted. Sexual abuse in sports is no longer something that can be swept under the rug. Survivors have made sure of that. They have ensured that future generations of athletes will be better protected, and that the systems that allowed abuse to occur will be held accountable. Sports organizations worldwide are now re-examining their policies and practices. When it comes to safeguarding athletes, USA Gymnastics, as well as other Olympic sports, are implementing stronger safeguards, better reporting systems, and educational programs to ensure that athletes know how to protect themselves. Coaches and staff are being held to higher standards, and organizations are under increased scrutiny to ensure that they are doing everything in their power to prevent abuse. However, despite the changes, the fight for complete reform continues. The survivors of Larry Nassar's abuse have made it clear that there is still much work to be done. They are determined to ensure that every sport, from gymnastics to football, is a place where athletes are safe and their voices are heard. And they will continue to push for change until that goal is fully realized. The impact on the broader conversation about sexual abuse of Larry Nassar scandal has had a profound impact on the broader conversation about sexual abuse in all aspects of society. It has not only changed how sexual abuse is addressed within sports, but has also sparked wider conversations about the ways in which abuse is handled in other institutions, such as schools, universities, and the workplace. The #MeToo movement, which gained momentum in the wake of high-profile sexual abuse cases, including Nassar's, has been instrumental in challenging the culture of silence that has long surrounded sexual abuse. Survivors of abuse are no longer afraid to speak out, and the public is increasingly unwilling to tolerate systems that enable abuse to continue. The Nassar case, along with other prominent sexual abuse cases, has shed light on the ways in which power and trust can be exploited. It has shown that sexual abuse is not just about individual perpetrators, but about the systems that allow them to thrive. The survivors of Nassar's abuse have become part of a broader movement for social change, one that is working to ensure that all victims of sexual abuse are believed and supported, and that those who enable abuse are held accountable. Conclusion. A new chapter for athlete protection story of Larry Nassar's abuse, and the survivors' fight for justice is far from over. The conviction of Nassar and the reforms that have followed are just the beginning of a long journey toward creating a safer, more transparent, and more accountable sports world. USA Gymnastics has made strides in reforming its policies and culture, but it must continue to evolve. The survivors of Nassar's abuse will continue to hold the system accountable, ensuring that no other athlete has to endure what they did. The legacy of their courage will be felt for generations to come. In the end, the fight for justice is not just about punishing one man. It is about changing the culture of sports, ensuring that every athlete, regardless of age, gender, or status, is given the respect, safety, and protection they deserve. The battle for systemic change continues, but thanks to the bravery of the survivors, the future of athletics may be brighter and safer for all. Part 5. The legacy and systemic change. Moving forward after the Nassar scandal. The unprecedented impact on USA Gymnastics and sports culture in the aftermath of the Larry Nassar scandal. The world of USA Gymnastics and sports as a whole was irrevocably changed. The shocking revelations about decades of abuse not only left a permanent scar on the sport, but also sparked a larger conversation about athlete safety, transparency, and accountability. As one of the most significant scandals in the history of sports, it forced organizations at every level to reevaluate their priorities and systems to ensure that something like this could never happen again. The scandal was not just about a single abuser, but about an entire culture of silence that had been embedded within USA Gymnastics and other sports organizations. For decades, athletes were conditioned to prioritize performance above all else, often at the expense of their mental and physical well-being. This culture, combined with the immense power that figures like Nassar held within the sport, created an environment where abuse could flourish unchecked. In the wake of the scandal, there was widespread distrust in the governing bodies of sports, particularly USA Gymnastics. The very organizations that were supposed to protect the athletes, such as coaches, officials, and administrators, were found to have enabled the abuse by either turning a blind eye or actively silencing the victims. This betrayal of trust was the catalyst for reform within the system. Reforms and restructuring. USA Gymnastics faces the future after the sentencing of Larry Nassar. USA Gymnastics and other institutions involved in the scandal were left to grapple with their own failure to protect their athletes. While some immediate changes were made, it was clear that the process of rebuilding would be long, difficult, and require deep-rooted systemic changes. The organization had to rebuild not only its credibility, but also its commitment to the safety and well-being of the athletes. In the immediate aftermath, USA Gymnastics undertook several reforms in an effort to ensure that their athletes would never again be subjected to the same abuses. One of the most notable changes was the implementation of a safe sport program that aimed to create a safer environment for athletes across all disciplines of gymnastics. The program sought to establish clear policies for preventing abuse, offer educational programs for athletes and coaches, and create an anonymous and confidential process for reporting abuse. However, many survivors, as well as advocates for change, felt that the reforms implemented by USA Gymnastics were insufficient. They argued that while the Safe Sport program was a positive first step, it needed to be expanded to ensure that it reached all levels of the sport and became more effective in holding organizations accountable. The survivors of Nassar's abuse wanted deeper cultural change, one that would prevent future abuses and protect athletes from similar predatory behavior. The survivors also called for greater transparency and accountability. USA Gymnastics was widely criticized for its lack of accountability and failure to address Nassar's actions for years. To address this, many advocates for reform suggested that USA Gymnastics should undergo a complete restructuring of its leadership and management to ensure that those who enabled the abuse were held accountable for their actions. Legal consequences and institutional accountability. Nassar was sentenced to a lengthy prison sentence. The battle for institutional accountability was far from over. The survivors sought justice not only for the abuse they suffered at the hands of Nassar, but also for the role that USA Gymnastics, Michigan State University (MSU), and other affiliated organizations played in enabling and covering up the abuse. Michigan State University, where Nassar had worked as a faculty member and physician, was also heavily criticized for failing to act on numerous complaints made about his behavior. MSU was slow to investigate the allegations, and many of the victims claimed that they were dismissed or ignored when they came forward. As a result, MSU faced legal action, and in 2018, it reached a $500 million settlement with more than 300 victims who had been abused by Nassar. Alongside USA Gymnastics, other entities involved in the scandal, including the U.S. Olympic Committee, USOC, were called into question for their failure to intervene and protect young athletes. The USOC was also sued for its role in the scandal, and while the organization denied complicity, it acknowledged the deep flaws in the system. In the wake of the scandal, the USOC promised to implement changes to ensure that future athletes would be better protected from abuse. These lawsuits and settlements were an important step in the legal battle for justice, but they did little to undo the damage caused by the systemic failures that allowed Nassar to continue his abuse. For decades, as the survivors' voices grew louder, their advocacy led to legislative changes and forced organizations to confront their past mistakes. The power of survivor advocacy, a movement for change. Perhaps the most significant and lasting impact of the Nassar scandal has been the rise of survivor advocacy. The survivors of Nassar's abuse became powerful voices for change in sports, lobbying for policy reforms, systemic changes, and greater protections for young athletes. Several high-profile survivors, such as Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, Michaela Maroney, and Jordan Weber, used their platforms to bring attention to the issue of sexual abuse in sports. These women, who had once been revered for their athletic achievements, became champions for justice, demanding accountability from the institutions that had failed them and the athletes who would come after them. The survivors' work extended far beyond gymnastics. They became advocates for all athletes who had experienced sexual abuse in sports and pushed for legislation that would better protect young athletes from future harm. They spoke at congressional hearings, media events, and public forums, urging lawmakers and sports organizations to adopt better policies for preventing abuse and providing support to victims. In particular, Simone Biles, as one of the most decorated athletes in history, used her platform to speak out about the trauma she endured. Biles' openness about her own abuse was pivotal in bringing attention to the psychological toll of sexual abuse on athletes. She used her position not only to advocate for her fellow gymnasts, but also to shed light on the issue of athlete safety in all sports. The larger conversation, a shift in sports culture at Larry Nassar scandal, forced the world to confront the systemic issues within the world of sports. It was no longer enough to think of sexual abuse as an isolated problem. The scandal showed that it was a pervasive issue within many sports organizations. From USA Gymnastics to other Olympic sports, the need for reform was clear. One of the major shifts in the conversation around sports was the growing recognition that athletes' welfare should not be sacrificed for the sake of success. In the past, many sports organizations operated under the mantra of win at all costs, which often resulted in athletes being pushed to their limits, both physically and emotionally. The Nassar scandal revealed how this focus on performance, above all else, contributed to an environment where abuse could thrive. Today, sports organizations are being forced to reevaluate their priorities. Athlete safety must now be seen as paramount, and there is growing momentum for more comprehensive, safeguarding policies across the world of sports. Safe Sport, as well as other similar programs, has become a blueprint for organizations across the globe to follow, and its principles are now embedded in the governance of many sports. However, despite these changes, there is still much work to be done. Survivors have made it clear that reforms cannot simply be about changing policies on paper. There needs to be a cultural transformation where athletes feel empowered to speak out without fear of retaliation. The stigma surrounding reporting abuse needs to be removed, and athletes must know that they will be supported if they come forward with their experiences. A long road ahead, ensuring lasting change, although significant progress has been made in the years since Larry Nassar's conviction. The road to lasting change is still long. The survivors have made it clear that their fight is far from over. They continue to advocate for reforms, not only within USA Gymnastics, but also across all sports organizations. Their ultimate goal is to ensure that future generations of athletes will never have to endure what they went through. One of the most critical ongoing efforts is to ensure that athletes' voices are heard and that they are given the power to shape the future of their sport. The Nassar case highlighted the importance of athlete advocacy, and many survivors are now working to establish more robust systems for athlete representation, particularly in governance roles within sports organizations. Simone Biles, Ailey Raisman, and others have already made significant strides in this area. They have pushed for more inclusive policies that give athletes a seat at the table. When it comes to decisions about their safety, well-being, and training environments, it is essential that athletes are not just the subjects of these organizations, but active participants in shaping the policies that govern them. Conclusion: a better future for athletics' legacy in the Larry Nassar scandal is one of pain, betrayal, and resilience. While the abuse he perpetrated on hundreds of young athletes can never be undone, the movement for justice, systemic change, and athlete protection has had a lasting impact. The survivors of Nassar's abuse have used their experiences to drive meaningful reforms in sports, and their advocacy continues to inspire change worldwide. The fight for a safer future for athletes is ongoing, but thanks to the courage of these survivors, we are beginning to see a world where the safety and well-being of athletes come first. The road ahead is still long, but every step forward is a step toward a better, safer, and more just environment for athletes in every sport. Call to action: thank you for watching this powerful documentary on Room 57. If you found the story of the Nassar scandal and the incredible bravery of the survivors as impactful as we did, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue bringing you more thought-provoking true crime stories that shed light on real-world issues. What do you think about the changes in sports culture and the continued fight for athlete protection? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. Let's keep this conversation going and ensure that the voices of those who've been wronged are never silenced. Also, if you haven't yet, make sure to hit the bell icon so you never miss an update from Room 57. Stay tuned for more gripping true crime documentaries as we continue to explore untold stories that matter. Until next time, keep questioning, stay informed, and remember that your voice can make a difference.